Why did the Lord greatly regret making Saul king? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of 1 Samuel on walking through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing 1 Samuel chapter 15, verses 10 to 19. But before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 10. But if you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So 1 Samuel chapter 15, beginning of verse 10. Now the word of the Lord came to Samuel, saying, I greatly regret that I have set up Saul as king, for he has turned back from following me, and has not performed my commandments. And it grieved Samuel, and he cried out to the Lord all night. So when Samuel rose early in the morning to meet Saul, it was told Samuel, saying, Saul went to Carmel, and indeed he set up a monument for himself, and he has gone on around, passed by, and gone down to Gilgal. Then Samuel went to Saul, and Saul said to him, Blessed are you of the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord. But Samuel said, What then is this bleating of the sheep in my ears, and the lowing of the oxen which I hear? And Saul said, They have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God, and the rest we have utterly destroyed. Then Samuel said to Saul, Be quiet, and I will tell you what the Lord said to me last night. And he said to him, Speak on. So Samuel said, When you were little in your own eyes, were you not head of the tribes of Israel? And did not the Lord anoint you king over Israel? Now the Lord sent you on a mission and said, Go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed. Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you swoop down on the spoil and do evil in the sight of the Lord? About 420 years earlier, the Amalekites attacked Israel while she was traveling to Mount Sinai, a sin for which God promised retribution. It was now in the days of Saul that God meted out that punishment. The Amalekites had further been thorns in Israel's side since the days of Moses, and so God was justified in acting this way, just as he always is when he punishes men and women for sin. King Saul was sent on a mission to utterly destroy the Amalekites. They weren't to leave anyone alive, and they weren't even to take spoils from war. The Amalekites were to be utterly devastated. Saul thus gathered a large army together and went and did as God commanded, except that he didn't. Sure, he utterly destroyed all the Amalekites he came in contact with, but he obviously stopped his mission early, for David is going to be in the same land fighting Amalekites in 1 Samuel 27. And then, of course, Saul didn't utterly destroy everyone he came in contact with, for he spared Agag, the Amalekite king. And then, of course, the people took from the best of what they found of the flock as spoils of war. In doing what they did, Saul did not completely follow the word of the Lord. Sure, he followed most of what God said, but he didn't do all of what God said. And this is the path that Saul had been on for quite some time concerning his relationship with God. He elevated himself to offer sacrifices when he got impatient waiting for Samuel. He didn't consult God before going to battle with the Philistines in chapter 14. He made a foolish vow telling his soldiers not to eat, thus hampering them in battle and causing Israel to sin later when in hunger they didn't drain the blood when they slaughtered their meat to eat. He then acted rashly again, vowing to kill anyone who broke his command not to eat, thinking that that was the reason that God didn't speak to him when he inquired about whether to go that night to plunder the Philistines. Thankfully for him, Israel stopped him from murdering his own son in the incident, but Saul sinned here by not completing his vow, yet would have sinned anyway by completing it. That was the dangers of foolish vows. So as we can see, even though Saul was a valiant man and a mighty warrior, he was an impetuous man, a man who lacked patience, and a man that would sometimes give in to his fears at the expense of obeying God. So, aggrieved by Saul's lack of obedience, that the Lord says in verse 11 that he greatly regretted making Saul king. Now, to those who believe in Calvinistic teaching, This is yet another verse that is hard to explain, for Calvinists view that the future is already written, and that whatever happens, happened because God willed it to be so. We have said time and time again that such teaching is false, but even to those who don't believe what Calvinists teach on determinism, this passage can lead to many questions. How can an all-knowing God regret something? Didn't God know that Saul would turn out this way? Now, we've run into this quandary before, back in Genesis 6, where verse 6 said that God was sorry that he made man. How can God be sorry for what he had done? And when we run into problems like this, it's not God who is wrong. It's us who don't fully understand things that we think we do. The Bible clearly teaches that God is all-knowing, but it also teaches that man has free will, with full ability to choose good and evil. God doesn't make our choices, good or bad. We make them ourselves. And yet, in spite of our choices, God can bring about his will as he did in the life and death of Jesus. A consequence, though, to God not making our choices for us, though, is the future is not written. At some point in our life, we can be obedient to God, then fully reject him, and vice versa. God knows our hearts, so he knows the weaknesses that exist in everyone, but he doesn't cause our weaknesses, nor do those weaknesses give us an excuse for sin. When God chose Saul, Saul was a humble man, a man not without faults, but a man that truly sought to follow God. If he didn't, he wouldn't have been concerned about offering God sacrifices at all before battling the Philistines or seeking God's counsel on anything. But then Saul gave in to his weaknesses, began becoming arrogant in his own strength and accomplishments, likely thinking that because he won, God must be with him. Samuel said as much when he came to see Saul in today's reading. And so, with God allowing Saul to make his choices, and seeing Saul choose the wrong on numerous occasions, including here in chapter 15, the Lord was saddened at this and regretted making Saul king. The Lord didn't make a mistake, for Saul had been a righteous man in the beginning. But Saul changed, just as anyone can change because of sin, which of course would lead to the Lord cementing his will in removing Saul as king. Now, it had been over 20 years by this point since the incident at Gilgal caused God to tell Saul that his kingdom wouldn't continue. God allowed Saul's kingdom to continue up till this point, and you never know. Had Saul behaved righteously, perhaps God would have changed his mind, or at least delayed fulfilling that promise. With Saul's actions here in disobeying the Lord's commandment, in not executing judgment against the Amalekites for their treatment of Israel, God's mind was made up, and there was no changing it now. Samuel was distressed at hearing the word of the Lord, for he was close to Saul. But as the Lord's prophet, Samuel would have to deliver the message of the Lord to Saul. Coming back from his mission, Saul passed through Carmel in the territory of Judah, where he set up a monument, most likely a pillar to himself, commemorating his victory, before returning to Gilgal. When Samuel came near, Saul ran out to meet him, saying gladly that he had obeyed the commands of the Lord. Samuel immediately knew that that wasn't true, for if he had, why was Samuel hearing the bleating of sheep? Saul explained that the people brought back the best of the sheep to sacrifice to the Lord, but the rest they've utterly destroyed. In shifting blame to the people for the bleating of sheep, even if he gave them a pure motive for keeping them, shows us even though Saul was king, he didn't always like the responsibilities that came with it. As king, he could have constrained the people. He did before by not allowing them to eat, and they listened. Saul would later blame that on fear. But again, he was king. People in authority have more responsibility than those not in authority and have to take responsibility for the actions of others, in that they weren't restrained from doing wrong. Leaders love to take credit for the actions of others when those actions prove to be good, but hate taking blame when the actions of others end up going bad. Saul was the one with the mission. He knew what the mission was, and yet he let the people take spoils anyway. Whether it was for sacrifice or not, it was wrong to disobey the word of the Lord, which is what Samuel told Saul here. He told Saul that when he was younger and was little in his own eyes, meaning humble, did God not anoint him king? And for that very reason? What changed? Why was he now disobeying the Lord in not utterly destroying the Amalekites? and all that they had. For Samuel, it was unbelievable the man that Saul had now become. For Saul, though, he still didn't see the problem, as is evidenced by his response, a response that we will cover, Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of 1 Samuel chapter 15, verses 20 to 35, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.